Hi everyone. Afternoon everyone. Very warm welcome to Community Land Scotland and our 2025 conference. It's lovely to see you all in this fantastic location, which I think is always the preferred location for CLS members to meet. It's absolutely brilliant, and the team here and the CLS team have done a great job in setting this all up. Sky always delivers, especially in terms of the weather, and so hopefully we'll all get the chance to get outside in a bit, because we have got a photo call, which I imagine we'll be doing outside, Lindsay, will we? So that's in the agenda for later, but I'll let you know when that's going to happen. So thank you to our conference sponsors, who this year are Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Scottish Government and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So many thanks to them and their support generally for the work that CLS does. Now, we're going to be taking some photos throughout the conference. Please let us know if you don't want your photo taken, and it'll be Meg and Heather who will be taking photos, and I'm sure most of you know them, but all of our staff here today have orange lanyards, so if you're a bit confused, don't know where you're going, got questions, then please find someone with an orange lanyard and they'll be able to help you. There aren't any planned fire alarms during the conference, so if the alarm does go off, we're going to evacuate, and the venue staff will tell us which way to go. So if you can just follow the CLS staff and the venue staff, and then we'll go outside and then resume as soon as we can. We have been asked not to leave any bags in the aisles, as this can cause an obstruction in the event of the evacuation. And finally, just to let you know, we're going to be live streaming all of the events today that take place in this particular conference space. There is a map in your delegate pack, which hopefully you found helpful, because the workshop breakouts are upstairs. But again, ask any of us, board members or staff members, if you've got any concerns about where you're going and what are you doing. So welcome again after that boring housekeeping introduction. It's really nice to see lots of people here, and I know lots of people in the room, but there's also loads of people I don't know, so it's really great we get new people coming every year, and I can say this from my experience of age, but it's really nice to see so many young people in the audience as well, so thank you for joining us today. Now, Community Land Scotland is an organisation that was born out of its members. A number of members got together, some of whom are here today, some time ago now, 15 years, and came up with the idea that communities in Scotland that were interested in acquiring land and building assets needed a voice to speak on their behalf. Hopefully we've continued and strengthened in doing that. And CLS are all about our members. The team, Meg and Lindsay and Norrie and Heather and the rest of the team are always out speaking to our members, to finding out what they need us to do on their behalf to advocate for them. And we'll pick up some of that later in a presentation that Josh is going to do. But first of all, what I'd like to do is introduce to the stage here one of our really inspiring urban members, GraceAnn from Viewpark, and some of you will know Viewpark in just outside Glasgow, but it's such an interesting project, and they've achieved an incredible amount, and I have to say it was a really hard journey to get to the acquisition itself, which no doubt you'll cover, but when you see what they've achieved in the short period of ownership, you're going to be blown away like we were. So can I introduce GraceAnn to the stage? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is my first conference. I've also never spoken to this many people before, so please be kind. I'm GraceAnn Colquhoun from the Viewpark Conservation Group, and I've been asked to tell you a little bit about a project today. Sometimes it's hard to imagine other people's projects if you haven't visited them, so I've tried to include some lovely images to give you an idea why we all love the estate so much and why we fought so hard to protect it. What I'm going to cover today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Viewpark Conservation Group, our achievements since we completed our buyout in 2020, our future aims, some learning moments from the last 5 years, and hopefully some helpful tips that might be able to help other community groups with their buyouts.
Can you just speak a bit closer to the microphone?
Sorry. So the Viewpark Conservation Group, we are a community-led charity. We're governed by a board of voluntary trustees, all from our local community. We're a very urban-based project. If anybody knows Lanarkshire, we are between Coatbridge, Bellshill and Viewpark, right in the middle of industrial estates, business parks and motorways. Viewpark's a housing scheme that is adjacent to the Douglas Support Estate that we bought during the community buyout. Viewpark, unfortunately, is listed as one of the highest deprived areas in Scotland. And the green space has been a lifeline for many generations of people growing up in that housing estate. Now that it's safe through community ownership, our aims for the estate are to preserve the estate's heritage, carry out the environmental conservation activities needed to help the estate regenerate, and include our community in all aspects of our work. So some of the achievements in the last 5 years is the heritage preservation. We're very lucky that we have quite a few amateur historians that live in our community. They've spent years researching and gathering information on the people that lived in the estate, the houses that were in the estate. They've shared all that knowledge with us. We've got lots of evidence from books, photographs, etc. And we're gathering that and identifying the best knowledge that we want to share with our community to put on our interpretation boards. Environmental conservation, so we have 172 acres of woodlands, waterways and meadows. The estate was unmanaged for 100 years, more than 100 years in fact, which on one hand was a good thing because nature was left in peace and allowed to do what nature does. But it also meant that the invasive species were also left to run wild, and we also had a lot of antisocial behaviour. When the groups first took over the buyout, they had to do years of clean-up involving taking out 17 burnt-out cars, 5 tonnes of asbestos. I think we're at 1,200 bin bags of rubbish now. It's continual, but the other thing that we're working on is helping the woodlands regenerate, our ponds, our river health, and our wildflower meadows. So we've got management plans in place. They're big tasks, they're ongoing tasks, but we've got them started and we're making our way with them. Community engagement, again, we completed our buyout in 2020, right in the middle of lockdown and COVID. So for about the next year and a half, we were impacted by whether we could have volunteers on site or whether we couldn't. But since then, we've had a significant increase in our community engagement. Our future goals, we want to continue expanding our project. We also want to carry out a community asset transfer and another piece of land. Our entrance to the estate, again, you cannot change nature. It's very steep and it's unsafe. It's also not in our land, it's on North Lanarkshire Council, the local authority's land. We've spoke to them several times in the last few years and they just don't have the funding to be able to make that more accessible. So there's an adjacent piece of land and we're in talks for a community asset transfer. That will let us have control over our own entrance and we can make one. It also involves putting a bridge over a river and a lot of work and a lot of funding, but it means we will be able to make our estate accessible to a lot more people from our community. We're also looking into maybe getting conservation or a sort of nature status. At the moment, when you look on maps, we're not recorded as a conservation project. We're on a long strip of green belt in Lanarkshire, and all that other green belt is earmarked for development, for more industrial estates, more housing, etc. So in order to protect our community asset, we want to try and get some sort of conservation status for it. The other thing we would like to get is a visitor centre and an outdoor community hub. With our community engagement, last year we were able to deliver 84 activities to our community and we had 593 participants take part in that. In 2022-23, Pass for All put a little tracker on one of our pass to start recording our visitors, and they send us the data for that every year. And last month we got the data for last year, and it told us that that tracker recorded 20,390 visits to our estate, which we're thrilled at, but it's also told us that we need to improve our facilities, and that's where the visitor centre and outdoor community hub will come in. Learning moments from the last 5 years. Many hands make light work. This is some of our volunteers. Initially, we started with our residents from our local community. That's them up on a litter picking activity. Last 2022, 2023, we started expanding our focus for new volunteers and people who benefit from the estate. And that's where we started working with other groups and other organisations. So up the top right there, that's our community orchard project, and that was in partnership with the Orchard project. Fergus came out first Saturday every month for a year, and this was the first time where somebody else came in and facilitated a project or an activity for us. So we really liked that one because the end result was we now have a community orchard, and in the second year they did a community food forest. But we were also able to take part in that one, whereas usually we're the ones that are running about organising everything, as you will know. We've also lots of scouts groups, local family centres, so they're helping increase our community engagement. The surprising one is guys down at the bottom right and the ones in the middle. They're actually organisations and businesses that got in contact with us. Part of their social values is that they want to pay back and do volunteer time in their local communities. So like I said, we've got lots of industrial estates, lots of business parks. The guys down the bottom, I think they're maybe our favourite corporate volunteers. They're from Amy Roads, and when they come in for the day, they bring hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of tractors, big lawnmowers, and they do a lot of maintenance in the spring to get the estate started. In the middle and the left, that's William Grant and Sons. They came out for the first time last year. They've been in contact last month. They want to now bring 3 different departments with between 15 and 20 volunteers in each department. So that's another 3 days of corporate volunteering that will get to help carry out the work in the estate. Another learning moment, plans do change. As part of our business plan, we wanted to install a mountain bike trail through our estate. 2022, North Lanarkshire Council put a £7 million state-of-the-art one 2 miles down the road for us. We know we can't compete with that, so we need to recognise that the business plan that was made 5 years ago, some areas it might not be relevant now. Experiential learning. No matter how much planning and time and research you put into an activity or a project, you'll only actually learn from it as you're doing it. We've been learning since 2020. We are getting better at it. We're starting to hit our deadlines. We've always hit our budgets, but we're starting to hit our deadlines. Another one, as you can see, all our activities are outside activities, which means when it's -4 and you've got a tree planting day organised, you can't plant trees. But we're now in the position where we've got plan Bs. We've made a workshop in our barn. We've got a community polytunnel as well. So now when the weather affects one of our activities, we just go inside and people can still do conservation activities. With events, Viewpark is a community, and they do have other community groups. So last year we clashed with one of the other community groups, and we both had a fundraising open day on the same dates, which meant our community had to choose between which one it went and supported. We all work with each other, we're all working for the benefit of the Viewpark community, so now we follow each other on social media, we meet up when we can because we're all both very busy projects, and now we make sure that we're not planning activities on the same dates. Helpful tips for other community projects. Share the load and build partnerships. Like I mentioned, the Orchard project partnership that ran for a year. Once that was completed, the volunteers that had been coming, and many of them were new volunteers that were just finding out about our estate and the project. We now have a new trustee member on our trustee board, and we also have a dedicated volunteer who's very experienced that fully organises and delivers everything in our community polytunnel, and they wouldn't have known about us if we hadn't had that partnership. The other one is increased capacity. We're aware that having a community-owned green space in Lanarkshire is very rare. We've got a lot of work to do. So we built a partnership with the local college because they've just recently started running conservation courses. They had 24 students that needed work placements. We've got lots of tree planting and invasive species management to carry out. So this year, the 24 of the students were coming out and doing their work placements with us underneath the guidance of our experienced rangers. They got practical skills to support the learning that they do, and we also got help with some of our large projects like our woodland management and our invasive species management plans. The other thing that we've learned, people like routine. So we've seen high numbers constantly returning as part of the Orchard project because it was booked in for the first Saturday every month for a year. So we now do that with our volunteer opportunities. We've got a men's group that work in the woodlands 10 o'clock to 2 every Wednesday, and it lets people incorporate their volunteering and their life routine. Long-term funding. So initially in the first 3 years of the project, we were looking and working with small funds, usually for 12 months. And that let us deliver short-term projects within the space of 12 months. But in 2023, we realised our woodland management plans, our river clean-up, summer plans were long-term goals. So we started looking at long-term, larger funding, a lot more work, a lot more effort, but the organisations that we worked with were so supportive. We were lucky in 2023 to get funding from the National Lottery Community Fund, and that funds our full-time community engagement ranger. And then in 2024, we were lucky to get funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and that funds a part-time project coordinator and a part-time estate ranger. So we can now work over the next 3 years on long-term plans rather than things that have to be planned, delivered and completed in 12 months. So long-term funding is worth the effort. The other helpful tip is record your work and your decisions. If you're the custodian of a community asset, we're wanting the community assets to be in our communities for generations. So it means 20, 30 years' time, other people from your community will be taking over the project. You need to leave a paper trail, not on top of just the minutes of the meetings that are recorded, almost like a day-to-day operational diary. We're beginning to keep one on what trees we're planting, where we're planting, what invasive species management's been done, when it's been done, so that the people that are taking over in the future can look back and build their work moving forward. Yeah, that one. Not sure if I'm going to do it digital. I like the idea of an old-fashioned ledger and making everybody write in at the end of the day what they done, where they done it, who our suppliers were, etc. I like that old school feel, but probably a digital one would make sense. That's me. Has anyone got any questions?
Brilliant. Thanks so much. I said it was an inspiring presentation, and it really is. You can see it. It's right around Roseanna, isn't it?
Yep, the most common feedback is I didn't even know this was there.
That's right. And what do you think would have happened if the community had not stepped in?
Oh, that would be industrial estate.
Yeah.
We recognise the need for economic growth. But we have, in Lanarkshire, we have so many industrial stroke business parks, and but largely every one's empty.
Yeah.
Where the government can bring money in the local area. The other thing that's really good, and we recognise it, it's not we hate industrial,
No.
everything, they're our neighbours. And they're starting to come in and sit at our picnic areas. We've got one gentleman that brings his laptop and just sits in the picnic area. What a better location to work for.
Well, they're part of your community as well, isn't it? It's understanding that businesses are part of your community, and I think what was really impressive was the number of businesses that you've got in now to come and help you do the work you're doing.
I don't know, you might know better that there's been a change in procurement, and
Yes.
they're having inflicts social values and all what we do.
Yeah.
But
We're getting large numbers coming in.
I say, well, the invasive species management work for them.
That's good. Good one. Well, well, GraceAnn and her colleague Ricky, Ricky's doing a session later on, are going to be around for the whole of the conference, so they've got loads of experience to share, particularly around that, how you work with local businesses, and particularly dealing with very tricky pieces of land, and I mean those stats around the number of burnt out cars, it's horrendous. So please speak to GraceAnn and Ricky over the course of the next 24 hours and get some tips from them. But can I thank you very much for being the first person, and you didn't sound nervous at all, it was absolutely brilliant, so thank you. Okay, thank you for that. So we've now got a short video message from the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and the Islands. I got that right. I could have just turned round probably. Marie Goujon, who's going to say a few words. Thanks.
Hello everyone, I'm so sorry that I can't be with you in person at Solmarostig, but I really hope that you all have a productive weekend while you're there. But firstly, I would just like to start by acknowledging the importance of the work that Community Land Scotland and its members does. Now, as Cabinet Secretary, I've had the privilege of visiting communities right across Scotland and seeing for myself the huge positive impact that community ownership can have on local economies, on services, as well as on community identity too. The latest round of the Scottish Land Fund Awards illustrates just the wide range of benefits that are possible through ownership, from a community cinema in Helensburgh to a visitor centre in Orkney. Now, the theme of this year's conference is about building on success. I strongly believe that community ownership has been a huge success and that we can and should encourage more communities to take ownership of land and assets by learning from the successes of recent years. I know that achieving community ownership isn't necessarily easy. I've heard directly from people within those community groups who've decided to take on that task, whether that's taking on ownership of buildings or land, and heard just how challenging that can be. But I also know that the help of organisations like Community Land Scotland is invaluable to community groups. They provide their own expertise in community ownership, and they can also help connect potential community owners to those groups that have already been through the ownership process. There are now 840 assets in community ownership in Scotland. That's a significant increase from the 96 assets owned in the year 2000. The number of community groups who own these assets has increased from 86 in 2000 to 533. And with your help, I'm absolutely certain that this number will continue to grow. Successive Scottish governments have made a number of changes over the last 20 years to legislation, funding and advice that have contributed to that success. So, for example, 4 community rights to buy have been introduced by land reform legislation. These rights have given communities a route to ownership that didn't exist before. Over 250 communities have registered their rights since the legislation was introduced. And recently, we also had the first successful use of one of the compulsory purchase rights for Poets Neuk in St Andrews. The application of that legislation, I think, sends an important message to landowners who are not taking responsibility for the land and assets that they own. Communities will be able to apply to remove that land from their ownership to create an asset that will benefit the whole community. However, I know that sometimes using these processes isn't easy and there is more that needs to be done. That's why this summer we'll be launching a public consultation on improvements we can make to the rights to buy so that they make an even greater contribution to community ownership. So I hope that you'll all contribute to that consultation when it's published. Doing so will help us to build on the successes of the last 20 years as we look ahead to the next 20 and beyond. The Scottish Land Fund also has a really important role. It enables communities to acquire assets, whether through right to buy, asset transfer or negotiated sales. Since 2016, we've awarded over £50 million to more than 300 community groups. And we're going to continue this with another £7.1 million available for the Land Fund this year. Over the course of the last year, the fund has helped communities in Westray to provide housing, in Partick to provide a health and wellbeing hub, and Moorbattle to provide a community pub and hub. It shows just the wide range of projects that communities across Scotland can take on, especially when we give them the tools to make it happen. Everyone will also no doubt be aware that we are currently progressing a new land reform bill that sets out ambitious proposals with strong links to community ownership. The bill seeks to empower communities with more opportunities to own land by introducing advance notice of certain sales from large landholdings. Owners of large landholdings will also have to engage with local communities, setting out how they use their land and how that contributes to key public policy priorities. Now, some of these changes will create more opportunities for communities, whilst others will make sure there's transparency on how landowners are using the land for which they are responsible. I'd really like to thank Community Land Scotland for their really valuable engagement and the suggestions for improvements as we've developed the bill. I know that some of you would have liked the bill to go even further, but I hope you nonetheless welcome its provisions as a really important step forward. This year, Community Land Scotland are embarking on a new project, making the most of natural capital, which you'll hear more about tomorrow. The Scottish Government is determined to ensure that natural capital projects engage with local communities and provide them with benefits. This focus on community is one of the 6 core principles in our natural capital market framework, which we published last year. And it's really great to see projects like making the most of natural capital really testing how we can best deliver this principle in practice. And with that, I just want to wish you all the very best for a successful conference, and I really look forward to hearing more about it and seeing the outcomes of your discussions over the coming few days.
Thanks, Heather, for pressing that button. I'm not sure I'd have been able to do it quite as well. Right, now we have next session. Someone said to me, this is the wise old owls. Now, a close friend of mine, Sandra, I don't want to include her in that. But we've got some colleagues here today, and we're going to do a bit of looking backwards, and I'm sure they'll have some thoughts about what the Cabinet Secretary has just had to say about where we are in the land reform journey. I'm sure they'll be happy to share those with us. Well, certainly Lorne and Peter will do. So can I invite Peter Peacock, Lorne Macleod and Sandra Holmes to the stage, please. Thank you.
So do you want to have to hold the microphone right here?
Okay, brilliant. So, the Wise Old Owl session. Our movement's come a long way, and obviously it started a long time before Community Land Scotland was created 15 years ago. And this opening session is really a chance for our panellists who have been involved in the land reform movement over the past decades to reflect on the movement's ambitious beginnings, share some of the successes that they've been involved with, but also think about some of the big questions for the future. And ideally, we really want you to be thinking about some of those big questions as well, and perhaps have some thoughts to share in the Q&A at the end. And with so much experience in the room, and I'm looking out at the room, seeing lots of people who have been involved in the movement for a long time, I think this is going to be a good discussion. I'm going to ask each of the panellists for an individual reflection of 5 minutes on their own personal experiences of land reform and community ownership, as well as the current challenges facing further progressive change and the opportunities that we need to take to overcome them. And then panellists will explore what's worked and what hasn't, and what we should be aiming for in the years ahead. Now, as the Cabinet Secretary said, we've got a land reform bill on the table at the moment, and Josh and colleagues have been working really hard on trying to refine and improve that. But we know there's other legislation coming too. So again, we really want you to be thinking about where we might go in the future. After individual contributions, I will run a facilitated discussion around some of those themes and topics. And as I said, this is the bookend, this end of the conference, where we're looking sort of backwards and learning some of the lessons. But at the end, the final session tomorrow morning, which Agnes is going to chair, we've got some of the younger members of the movement who are going to be looking forwards and perhaps giving a bit of reflection from them as well. So can I hand over? I think we're going to go Lorne and then Peter and Sandra, and I don't propose to say anything in between if you're just happy to follow each other. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, Ailsa, Raeburn and Shaw due up the Solberostig. Delighted to be here today at Solberostig, and thanks for inviting me to speak. I'm over to Lord Macleod. A lot has happened over the last 30 years. My first involvement with community land ownership was back in 1993. That was 32 years ago when the Borman Anashada 4,500 acre estate just north of Portree on the island here was purchased by the community. And that was an interesting one because it followed quickly on the heels of the Crofters Trust buyout, which was very high profile the previous year. But in that case, in the Crofters one, the Crofters were the members, Crofters had the votes. But Borman Anashada took what I thought was a very positive and forward-looking decision that everybody in the community, no matter if they were a Crofter or not, would have a vote. And that's an important blueprint which I think has been carried forward by many community landowners ever since. My own involvement, I was involved in preparing the business plan for the GIA buyout way back, and then involved for 6 years on the board as a cooperative board member, and then I went on to involvement 6 years on the board of Star and Lewis, which is the 93,000 acre buyout for the islands of Ailsa, South Uist and Benbecula. And so I pay tribute to you all because having been at the coalface, I know the hard work that has to be undertaken by all community landowners day to day. I do remember starting both in GIA and in South Uist, with zero money in the bank, and you have to move quickly, and I pay tribute to Sandra and her team because the advisory support, the revenue support in the early days was absolutely crucial. But also, I would move on to say that renewable energy and community ownership of renewable energy, 100% community ownership in both the GIA context and South Uist, were absolutely crucial for funding. You had that financial underpinning moving forward. So I'm quite positive to hear some wording about community renewable energies maybe coming back more into getting financial support. So I think that's going to be most important in moving forward. But community ownership has been a huge success story. It's not easy. You're never a prophet in your own land. You have to bring your communities with you. But I think the results are showing in many community landowners forging ahead. I personally am more convinced than ever of that for large scale buyouts it is an ideal model because you have all the benefits of business growth, you've got job creation, you've got population retention, population growth, community projects. It's an ideal blueprint that many others should follow. I would suggest, though, that there is a feeling at the moment that maybe some of the momentum has moved out of some of the large-scale community buyouts. And indeed, way back in 2009 was when many of us came together to form Community Land Scotland, which has done an excellent job for keeping community land ownership at the forefront of public thinking. It's also worrying that recent research points to greater concentration of land ownerships. Existing landowners are actually buying more land. So hopefully the land reform bill can be strengthened, and certainly had a look at some of the amendments that have been put forward, over 500 so far. And it's good to see things like compulsory sale orders amongst that amendment, and also taxation. I believe quite strongly and more convinced than ever that to tackle some of the large-scale land ownership, we need to move to taxation, whether that's a land and building transaction tax as a kind of additional supplement for purchases over a certain level, or whether that's a land value tax. Community right to buy was mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary there, the success of Part 5 to promote sustainable development in Poets Nook in St Andrews. So maybe that will signal an invitation to other communities to come forward where you can have an absolute right to buy. You're not waiting for land to be put in the market. Although I would stress that a lot more changes are needed to community right to buy. I personally favour the simple pre-registration process that was proposed by Harper Macleod solicitors, and I think that would be a simple amendment that would make it workable for many communities. So that's about all I was going to say in my wee 5 minute slot. I also know that you will be working together in promoting the kind of manifesto for the 2026 Scottish parliamentary elections, and I think that's an important role to do. But I'll just leave it there just now.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Lorne. Peter.
Okay, thank you, sir. Well, it's good to be here, and as Lorne said, it's good to be nice. It's good to be amongst people who are doing really important, impressive things, and this kind of event allows us to celebrate a lot of that. I think we're also a chance to remain aware of the frustrations that many people feel that they can't make the progress that some industry have made, and we need to keep that very firmly in mind. It seems to be. Now, one of the key parts of Community Land Scotland is to promote more community ownership. For me, in order for that to happen, you've got to have the right policies in place at a national level, and you've got to have the right legal framework in place also to support that. And that, since devolution 25 years ago, devolution has brought significant change to both the law and to the policy frameworks for land and for land reform and community ownership as part of that. And that's been the work of successive governments of all political hues that have served in office in Scotland. But sadly, if you look on the ground, despite all your efforts, you're very much a minority interest in Scotland. You represent all the ownership that the Minister talked about represents less than 3% of Scotland's land ownership. And as Lorne just said, it's clear that the progress that's been made, particularly on large buyouts, has stalled significantly. And if anything, the work of Andy Whiteman, who's here and can speak to that work, demonstrates that land is concentrating more. Fewer people own even more land. And on the other side of that equation, the frustration of communities and individuals looking for land for their purposes that can't get it. And that is despite the fact that for 25 years, between all the main political parties, there's been a consistent policy to see a greater diversity of ownership of land in Scotland. So what's now needed to deliver that? I would suggest the following. The first is you've got to have enduring political support for reform and for change in land ownership. I was asked today to reflect from a Labour point of view on that, having been a Labour politician in the Parliament, and Roseanna Cunningham, who can't be here today, unfortunately, was going to reflect from an SNP point of view. She and I had a long conversation 2 weeks ago. We do speak, and I know quite well with Roseanna, so we spoke, and she and I were going to be saying very similar things about what is needed. From a Labour perspective, I mean, Labour's origins are in the greater social justice, in a redistribution of power in society, a rebalancing of power, and of people working together for common good. So it just seems natural that come the advent of devolution, with the land question in Scotland still unanswered, that a Labour and a Lib Dem government should bring land reform forward and legislate on that, so legislate on bits of land reform, but also to empower communities. And that was free, of course, for the first time from the House of Lords, who could no longer interfere in that kind of legislation, which they'd done successfully for several hundred years before that, protecting the interests of landowners. Now that work the Labour Lib Dem administration started was continued in 2015, then 2016, and again this year by the SNP administration. And whilst there was always political spats around all of this, they were all the parties, the main parties, from support that the Greens and others are also supporting those changes. Now, personally, I have a lifelong interest in land reform. I had an epiphany, as they say, when many years ago as a teenager, which made me realise there was something very fundamentally wrong with land ownership in Scotland. And whenever I had the chance, I've advocated land reform. And my generation, and I was talking to Roseanna about this, saw land reform as a very major question. It was so few people owning so much land had huge economic and social consequences for the way in which Scotland operated, how power and wealth was distributed in our society. And the devolved Parliament gave the opportunity to act on that. But the truth is that every generation of politicians needs to see the land question as important if the change is to continue and to endure and changes to actually happen. And I would say it's a mistake to assume that that would simply be the case. Priorities and enthusiasms in politics change over time. And you've got to make sure, if you want this to happen, that land reform needs to remain a firm part of the agenda. And for me, That means that now it needs to be reasserted as an objective, and it needs to be reinforced to the political parties as part of their historic mission, and made relevant to today's immediate circumstances and the circumstances we can see coming. Now, the new standard bearers of that reform agenda, if you have to have them in the political context, need strong analysis to work from, and that is going to back up their case of why it is that land reform is fundamental, and I do stress it is fundamental for me and many others, to a more just and inclusive Scotland. And I suggest that Community Land Scotland, is that a 1 minute warning? Fine, okay. I suggest that Community Land Scotland have got a major part to play in that reshaping of the argument and reasserting that argument to meet social, economic and environmental needs. The Land Commission has just launched a major consultation which will take place during this year, a very important consultation, I think, asking people what would a reformed land of Scotland look like, and what the steps to get there. And that's a great opportunity for Community Land Scotland and many others to have the arguments again, to reassert them and restate them. To achieve the outcome for me has to be a material diversification of ownership. And that's an intergenerational challenge, sadly. I would like to see it as an event, but it's not going to be that. It's an intergenerational challenge. And we need to see more people owning far more land shared amongst us. And those who currently own most, I'm afraid, because it's a finite resource, will have to do with less. Now, that's a really difficult road to travel. But it needs to be travelled if you want to make that kind of change, fundamental set changes to our society. It's not going to happen without enough political consensus for that to happen. And that means we need to work on that and work constantly on that to keep the politics of this fresh and relevant and looking forward. For me, a key legislative goal is to turn the policy towards diversification, which we've had for 25 years, into legislation, which is seeking to advance diversity of land ownership as an economic cause in its own right, to share wealth, to share power more equally in our society so we can all prosper. And with that, I'm just in time.
Thanks, Sandra. Thank you. Excuse me, I'm Sandra Holmes. I'm with Highlands and Islands Enterprise. I'm very, very proud to be classed as an owl. So my journey here goes back to 2001, and I've got Lorne here to thank. Lorne recruited me into John Watt's Community Land Unit, and this was to deliver the first ever Scottish Land Fund, which back then was a lottery fund. I arrived with lots of enthusiasm based on nothing more than being totally inspired back in the 80s by a production of the Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil. So that, together with a vague awareness of what the Aston Crofters were doing, and then Egg and Neudart, was my introduction before joining the team. So back then in 2001, there was no Land Reform Act, there was no Community Land Scotland, and there was no Land Commission. And we had a £15 million fund over 5 years to invest in community ownership projects, and we supported 134 projects, 25% of which were land-based. And if we fast forward to where we are today with the current land fund, about 2% of the projects are land-based projects, and I'll return to that. So that first lottery fund ended in 2006, and there was a gap of about 6 years before the two gentlemen to my side and lots of other folk in the room created what is now Community Land Scotland and persuaded Scottish Government to launch a new land fund. And there's been a Scottish Government funded land fund ever since 2012 to the present day. And as you can imagine, there's a very strong correlation between land fund funding and acquisitions. So just some reflections, and it's very difficult in 5 minutes, and I've got my eye on Lindsay here. But first one is just scale, and just looking back, it's clear that the number of hectares being purchased has significantly decreased over time. The first land fund brought in 68,000 hectares in community ownership with 15 million. The current land fund with a budget of 29 million so far has brought in 3,000 hectares. That's a reduction of 95%. So double the investment and 5% of the acquisitions. However, there's a lot to be unpicked in this. The figures don't show the whole picture. And it's clear that the buyouts that have happened today are heavily skewed by a small number of buyouts in the Western Isles. So where Aston Crofters, Egg and Neudart kind of grew from failed land ownership, The Outer Hebrides buyouts were a wee bit different. It was either owners looking to sell, and there was also a bit of community unease at a number of large-scale wind farms that were being proposed for the area. So momentum grew out there, and lots of land changed into community ownership. And I think there's a huge area here that's really ripe for research. Is it lack of appetite? Is it lack of opportunity? Or is it other priorities taking groups' attention to things? Another reflection, just briefly, is the legislation, and I think this has been a clear game changer on two fronts. I think firstly, it gives a real clear statement that community ownership is in the public interest, and it's now normalised, and that's fabulous. And we've also got Community Land Scotland, the Land Commission, etc., so lots going on there. But it's also created a very supportive policy environment with support to the Land Fund and also revenue support to the likes of Community Land Scotland and DTAS, providing really important third sector intermediary support. However, the legislation itself hasn't really driven systemic change in itself. There's been fewer than 30 acquisitions through the 4 community right to buys. And today we're seeing very, very few TIMIUS registrations. Asset transfer, however, and that's the purchase of public assets, has been very impactful with over 250 approvals through the legislation and many more done through negotiated sale. That's also coincided with public sector withdrawal in certain areas. Just moving on to touch on demand, these opportunities are available throughout the whole of Scotland, but most of the activity is happening in rural areas. It's 75% rural to 25% urban. In terms of geography, just under half have taken place in the Highlands and Islands, about 40% in the Scottish Enterprise area, and about 12 to 13% in the Stostey area. And I think it's just worth mentioning islands. They're completely punching above their weight. 33% of the supported acquisitions are in islands, 81% of the land mass is in islands, and 45% of the investment has been invested in islands. So in terms of challenges and opportunities, very briefly, a key challenge is land values, and that's land values in terms of land and also buildings. A reduced land fund budget is a challenge. The land fund is a key facilitator, and currently it's very competitive. And at the moment, we're approaching the end of Land Fund 4, and we don't yet know until perhaps after the election whether there will be a Land Fund 5. In terms of opportunities, I think it's really encouraging. There's a community right to buy underway. And I'm very hopeful that TIMIUS registrations will become more of a feature going forward. My last opportunity is perhaps somewhat niche, but it's very, very important. And this is in the area of state subsidy, or subsidy control, as we now call it. Over the years, and some folk in the room here will identify with this, we've really struggled to mitigate the risk of challenge from putting investment of public funds into acquisitions. But I'm really pleased now that the Land Fund and also Highlands and Islands Enterprise have now both got dedicated subsidy schemes. So for the first time, we can actually put subsidy into projects without the fear of significant challenge. So this puts funding for the sector onto a very secure footing for the first time in 26 years. And I think it's something not to go unnoticed. So just to wrap up, they say that the TV at Agna Black Oil was described as a play with a beginning, a middle, and as yet no end. And I think that very much reflects where we are with land reform. And it's really encouraging that the Land Commission are doing the work with Scotland's Land Futures, which will hopefully shape the next chapter to come. Thank you.
Thanks very much to our panel there, in particular thanks to Sandra who stepped in at the last minute only this week. It's always great to hear from recovering politicians, but I think Sandra, with her many years experience supporting communities and that insight into things like state subsidy is absolutely critical to the success of our movement. So thanks again, Sandra, and those who will repeat for their reflections. I want to start off. I'm going to come to the room if that's okay. You've all mentioned now that community land ownership is now a settled policy intent. All of the parties supplying or supported. All of the parties support land diversification in subterraneans. But we're arguably in quite a different economic and political environment to those early years of devolution. We're all aware of what's going on in the world around us at the minute. And how do you think that's impacting upon the ambition and reality of land reform? So when you think about things like Roseanna and the rise of reform, things like Do you think those are taking away from some of the issues that you raised, Peter, about the absolutely essential nature of land reform to delivering economic justice and social justice?
Well, I was thinking with this with somebody else this morning that I think we've managed to corral ourselves by our own arguments into being only seen as the community sector. And that's a good thing in many ways, but there's negatives come with that. So at the centre of government and at the highest levels of local government in terms of economic development, we are not seen as relevant to the future economy of Scotland. We're seen as marginal. Yes, we don't affect it by any. It's nice to have, but let's keep it there. That's why I think the arguments need to turn a bit and turn onto much more of an economic argument. Where is it that the greatest economic growth has been occurring in Scotland in the last 25 years? I would argue probably Egg, Gia, Noidert, in other communities of that scale and sort. And what's happening there is we're seeing enterprise being released, people taking responsibility, greater agency given to communities, and we're seeing the growth of private businesses and local enterprises happening in those communities in a way that is not necessarily happening elsewhere. A growth in confidence and in the future looking in many ways very rosy, new housing being built and so on and so forth. But we tend to have argued that not on economic grounds, that this is a central economic question. If you really want to see Scotland's growth grow, at the same time as protecting our environment, if you want to see more jobs created, if you want to see more enterprise, well, do the things that we know are proving to do that. That's more here. It's what's happening here. So I think that's why we need to refocus our arguments a bit, reassert them, reshape them, find a new language to describe the economic force that this can. Now that's when we start making attention more centrally of politicians. As long as they think we're a fringe interest, we want to remain a fringe interest. We've got to muscle our way in, and I think it's economic arguments that are going to do that.
In response to a changing economic picture, I can even bring that down to a local level. I've been involved in a business in the north of the island for 25 years, and we had to close part of the business. There was a successful part of the business through difficulty in recruitment, and the demographics in this island and many parts of the rural area are really poor at the moment. We're doing a development of a new building, and we're having to bring in a building company from Lorne and Dumfriesshire. So this is a properly functioning local economy at the moment. And I think we need to clearly articulate the links to land and housing and the need for housing for young people, and articulate those links much stronger, because land is at the root of many of the issues that our local island and rural communities are suffering at the moment. And I think we need to pitch that much stronger with politicians.
I'll just add very briefly to what's been said. What we're seeing and what was outlining in my quick 5 minutes was the projects that we're supporting just now look and feel quite different to the projects that were supported before. And my sense here is it's not that the appetite isn't there. I think there's just more pressing needs that communities are facing in the current climate. So we're seeing more and more communities putting their precious time and resources into picking up where the public sector has stepped back for various reasons. And also housing, if you get involved in a community-led housing project, you really don't have any headroom to do much else. So I don't think it's appetite, and I don't think it's capacity in terms of skills and ability or capabilities. I think it's really headroom, and there's communities trying to sustain existing community assets with cost of living, cost of energy, etc., etc. It's quite hard to be ambitious when you've got some quite pressing things that you're dealing with. I'm hopeful that looking longer term that we'll get back to seeing more acres coming into land ownership.
Brilliant, thanks all. Question to the room. Any questions from the room for August panelists? Any shy? Right, Mr. Gibson.
Thank you.
Sorry, do you mind saying? I know you're moving.
Using you still and other things. And we thought about farming assets in the and family owning land. That's the address point for the big change. But actually, So we have to ask what they want. And to a certain extent, the land reform legislation actually provides the ability to get on that basis. For example, the land citizens from these large estates, where they are trying to find ways to develop parts of the settlement. But we need to find a way in law to make sure they manage the estates with that as an absolute condition. And I wonder if interest. Because I think fundamentally we've got to move on from where volunteers are able to do this and really schools of communities local working together to employ to do the hard graft. Now, that's been the mainstay in much of what New Zealand, Scotland has done for, but we need an awful lot more of the professional backing for the volunteers who've done so much. Can't do it all the time.
No, great question. Thanks, Rob. Who'd like to? Lorne, are you happy to pick that question?
Maybe pick it up. I worry about public sector cuts and impacts on budgets. That it was invaluable in the early days of GIA and Sinuous to have that kind of revenue funding until the point came when you had your own income sources in terms of renewables. What I would flag up in response to that, I think we must. The timing is now for, and I don't believe this off the point in relation to community land. It's about community shared ownership of renewables, i.e. the big developers that have got so many planning applications in the pipeline, and I'm not advocating for or against, but if they are to get planning, there must be community shared ownership, because the actual community benefit funds, the kind of £5,000 per megawatt installed, is basically crumbs off the table compared to the significant funding that could come into communities to allow land purchases of scale to happen, and other community resilience and other support, because I can't see it coming from local authorities and other public sector bodies that are absolutely stretched at the moment.
Thanks, Robert.
I was going to pick up on something about, I've been reflecting and prepared to discuss, having that conversation with Roseanna Cunningham, and her comments about, our generation was she and I are the same age. Our generation, understood all this and could drive it. And I was reflecting on what were the forces at work that led up to devolution. And I've gone back to sort of 1970 to mid-70s, and John Keewan's work, the prior work of what Andy Whiteman's, continuing and more sophisticated. That was a real awakening in Scotland, in the sense that it brought to life the fact that we all knew that very few people owned a lot of land, and they began to quantify it. And that was a kind of reawakening. And then there were things that, Sanders talked about, the 784, creation of the West Highland Free Press, the Macleod lectures that ran up to devolution, which John Donald Dewar, Jim Hunter and others spoke on, the work of Jim Hunter and the Crofters Union. All of these things, and many more things, were coming together to give a momentum which, come devolution, was irresistible. It had to be acted, and that's why we've seen what we've seen. With the benefit of hindsight, a lot of these steps, our land reform, seen internationally, is seen as very radical, it's seen as very bold, it's seen as very enabling, and in many respects, the concepts of the legal framework are very good, and it's further strengthened, you could argue. But when we now go on the ground, it's not delivering anymore, and that's why we need to refresh. So I would ask myself, what's the thing that's going to reawaken the debate for the next time? And to me, it comes back to your first point, Rob, that it's where does wealth and power lie in our society? And we really need to create a new awakening on just what's going on about the consequences. And there are huge economic consequences from the current land ownership patterns. But I don't think that's widely understood in a kind of immediate, real sense in Scotland. So I don't know quite how we do this yet. I think it's part of the debate to come. But I was certainly pitching in that debate, how do we enliven, refresh, reinvigorate, reawaken Scotland to what's been happening, and examine where the wealth that we, the taxpayer, are paying for, whose pockets is ending up in. And it's very few pockets in Scotland indeed, and enormous power from that. So to me, that's a new political force that's required to give the whole thing more oomph. But that's up to I mean, I was trying to say this in another audience to somebody who was from Scottish Land and Estates. They say, don't expect Rob Gibson and Michael Foxley and myself and Andy White and others just to die out and that'll be finished. There's a new generation coming up who are going to take over the arguments, but we need to see that younger generation coming through, and there are some of them in this room, to say, this is a cause we must continue to fight. And we must continue to expose the inequalities in our society that are fundamentally dependent on land ownership. But people in Scotland think this is the way things are. It ain't. Go to any other country in Europe, it's not like this. Land ownership is entirely different. The economy is different. The share of wealth is different. And there's cause for that, but we need to examine that. Sorry, I'm going.
Well, I want to actually minutes, so if you just wait for Ross to bring back and say who you are, where you're from, but I think I'll stand you first this time. Hi, Ashley Williams, I'm the development manager for the West Initiative down in Greece, Norway. Just be interesting for taking on points about how land is becoming more concentrated despite our best interests and community ownership. In South Scotland, we have the Cunningham estate as one of the biggest landowners. We've got our land from them, they have some sort of communities as well, but the main recipient of their changing business model is Jones, the commercial forestry operators. And it's what your thoughts are and how to tackle that argument where commercial forestry companies come in and will be fulfilling Scottish government priorities and all the council arguments as well. And the communities in South Scotland, it's a really difficult landscape to navigate. Thanks very much, are you happy to answer this?
Yes, I work for obviously a Scottish Government NDPB, but just in what you're saying there, Angela, I think one thing in terms of community ownership, obviously it's encouraging communities to be proactive and get TIMI's registrations in, but I appreciate that what you're talking about there doesn't always have to be communities only things. It's trying to get great wealth happening locally from private businesses, be it locally based businesses or business based afar. And there's obviously the Community Wealth Building Bill going through Parliament just now, and who knows exactly what's going to come out of that. But despite its name, community wealth building is all about reframing the economy and trying to get monies to stay rooted more within local communities. And I think there's a lot of work happening just now, obviously, in the new team that Community Land Scotland have set up, looking about community benefit from natural capital. You know, there should be aspirations for greater community benefit from all forms of land use, not just tied into natural capital. So I think there is work to be done there and things to be continued.
Thanks, Angela, for the question there. Certainly, when I was a Scottish Land Commissioner, you went to public meetings south of Scotland, and this was always the topic, and I can totally understand why. You know, if the Land Reform Bill as drafted, but with amendment, is worded correctly, then I have some hope for the lotting proposals, that there may be, you know, some subdivision of land that comes to the market. I think that will be important to allow additional opportunities for communities to come together. Also, the pre-notification proposals within the land reform legislation. And the other thing that needs to be looked at is there are a huge growth in off-market sales, so nobody knows about them. And we look at situations throughout the whole of Scotland. And I think openness and transparency is another thing that needs to be addressed there, that we maybe give communities greater opportunities to participate in land ownership. The other aspect, of course, is land prices have gone up significantly. When I was involved, the GIA buyout was about $4.5 million, still on a Zoomish, the South US $4.5 million. These estates now are 10, 12, 15 million, just as they were. So, you know, the difficulty for communities to come forward. So I think, you know, a lot of things need to be addressed, and hopefully there will be a lot of strengthening within the amendment process in the Land Reform Bill.
Thanks, Lorne.
Okay, sorry.
That was it. Are we? Oh, okay. This is 14:15, okay? What am I supposed to be doing? Well, I'm going to take chair's privilege. Michael. And Michael will make it quick, and we'll have some quick answers, and then we'll move. So, go, Michael.
I'm going to make it really quick. 3 thoughts. First of all, we need to get angry. The community right to buy property, community right to buy property, SRE forward. We just need to start getting really, really angry. Lord, first, the close markets, maybe straight down the road from me. First, anything you've been bought was the store has got new instruction. And the next one is leadership, which obviously needs to and we need people to lead at every level, that's community, local authority. And third is money. Now, originally Government Parliament was predicting 110 billion to be spent on the island, or most of it, in the next 10 years. The law says we need to grab a bigger rock of that 7% to buy estates, not think really short, buy the estate and own the renewable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
Well said, Michael. Thank you. No comment each.
No, Michael's as angry today as he was when I knew 40 years ago. And it's absolutely brilliant. Keep going.
No, Sandra, one final thought?
Well, one final thought I wanted to throw in was about charities, and that is the fact that it's been signalled there may be a fundamental review of the charities going forward, and I think we need to be, as Michael says very loudly, we should be shouting in that case for open membership of charities, particularly landowning charities. Because there are some that are for various tax benefits. They're essentially private family closed trusts, and I think if we open that up, particularly in the situation with the Landowner Lands Trust down the road there, if there had been no membership, perhaps some of the situations.
Thank you. Thanks, Laurel.
And I'll just say it's really encouraging to come to sessions like this to get people coming together and getting inspired and taking action. That's all I'll say on that.
Thank you. Thanks very much, our panel.